is Awesemo MMA Live Before Lock. Not exactly right before lock because we've got a lot of stuff going on the channel today. MLB Live Before Lock and NFL Preseason Live Before Lock. So all the reason, guys, like this video, subscribe to the YouTube channel. Plenty of DFS content coming up. Today's show is sponsored by Monkey Knife Fight. But first, Pete, how are you doing?
What's up, buddy? Shout out to Greg doing all this content for the channel. So if you appreciate what Greg's doing, definitely hit that thumbs up button. Happy to have him here again. Another card, an interesting one because, the Ultimate Fighter implications, but I'm excited to get through this card and talk about each fight with you.
Yeah, and, this is, to me, kind of interesting because even though it's an Ultimate Fighter card, technically an Ultimate Fighter finale, the UFC's kind of buried it. Like other Ultimate Fighter, other tough finales, like it's been a really big deal. This one, not so much. Like there's, a good main event. It's a fight that I'm looking forward to, and that's in Barboza versus Chikadze. But, other tough finales, there's been, a bigger marquee event, and they've made a bigger deal out of it. This is just kind of like another Vegas card, which I kind of think is interesting. And maybe it also says what the UFC views tough as at this point. I think they view the Dana White Contender Series as maybe a little bit more of a vehicle for finding talent. And that's also why, in my opinion, I thought this tough season was maybe one of the weaker ones we've seen from a talent standpoint. I don't know that any of these guys are ever going to be top fighters in the UFC, but we shall see. The fights still are going to play out. And something you mentioned before the show started when we were just talking off camera, and I'm kind of curious to hear what it is that made you say this. It was right before we started. You said there were some guys that looked a little bit different to you on the scales yesterday, maybe than what you were expecting, what they've seen in the past. So what did you mean by that?
Yeah, so from top to bottom, Edson Barboza, it's amazing. He still makes featherweight. It's just crazy. He's shredded from, all over. I will say in the co-main event, Brian Battle is going to be a very chalky play, but I did think that at the weigh-ins, he looked a little lethargic. Just could mean that he had a difficult cut. He's probably a big guy. Cutting weight is not pleasant by any means. Some people disguise it better than others. We all hate it, right? We all suffer through it and hate it. But, I did notice that Brian Battle looked a little lethargic in that sense. You saw Kevin Lee sizing up Daniel Rodriguez, and also mentioning that Rodriguez looks small. Kevin Lee looks like a monster, but I don't know how to really take that into consideration because he has a questionable gas tank. I do think that him not cutting to lightweight will probably provide some better cardio for him. But, I was impressed with his physique for sure, but obviously it's the cardio that we're always worried about. And then if I go and I look at the rest of the card, Sam Alvey, typical Sam Alvey fashion, looked pretty similar to always. I will say that Mana Martinez in the opening bout, which I think is going to be a very volatile fight, him missing weight by 5 pounds initially, he's having to deal with a lot of adversity, right? Like he just lost his coach not too long ago, his head coach, and that's going to be affecting a fighter emotionally. Could also affect a fighter with just anything. Like it's tough to balance all of that and now try to make weight. And then when I see him miss weight, it does raise some eyebrows, but I do think that he's extremely dangerous in this situation. His opponent looked great on the scale, but doesn't have the skill set that I think that Mana Martinez has the advantage in this matchup. So just some notes, in regards to some of the matchups, and perhaps you want to temper expectations or lower some ownership. But I think if you just manipulate exposure just a tiny bit off of weigh-ins, it can be very helpful.
Yeah, so let's start by talking about the main event. And also, a lot of those fights you mentioned, the Mana Martinez one, that one's also kind of wonky just because we've got Guido Canetti, who's super old, and he's 41 years old now. But I think if he was younger, not that he was particularly great fighter at any point, but I think he would have been maybe a little more able to exploit potentially some of the weaknesses that Mana Martinez might have in the grappling department. But him being 41, that also adds a little bit of an element of surprise. And the same, like with Kevin Lee, you mentioned him, he's moving up a weight class. He's fighting somebody who's should be way bigger than him, but also we've seen Kevin Lee really talented. Like we've seen Kevin Lee thoroughly handle Edson Barboza's in the main event today. And we've also seen Kevin Lee, not show up in spots where I thought he was going to win pretty comfortably. Also, he's torn both his ACLs. So this is a card that I think is a lot of variance. I like it for GPPs, but a lot of uncertainty. And that starts with the main event. It's a very tightly lined fight. We've got currently Edson Barboza, a slight favorite, but for all intents and purposes, the implied betting odds here, it's like a 55-45 fight. I personally don't see it that way. I think Barboza should be a little bit bigger of a favorite, mostly just because I don't think Chikadze is really that tested at this point in his career. Obviously, the recent knockouts have looked really good on his record, but the Cub Swanson fight, that's the biggest win on his resume. But some of the other fights he's had in the UFC, whatever, he beat Jamie Simmons, who was like a foot taller than and had like a ridiculous reach advantage against. Some of his other fights, Omar Morales, he finished that fight as like a minus 400 favorite. Morales took that fight on like 3 days notice. Erwin Rivera, he's had, talk about guys with issues. He like tried to kill his mom and his sister, and he's having all kinds of mental issues. Split decision win over Jamal Emmers. I thought Emmers won that fight. Emmers is also on the card today. Split decision win over Brandon Davis. I also thought Brandon Davis won that card. And then on the Contender Series, he was taken down 4 times by Austin Springer and ends up losing. So talk me into this. Do you agree with this line? Because I think that this is maybe overlooking Barboza and overrating Chikadze a little bit.
Yeah, I think that I would agree. And I do like Edson Barboza in the fight. I think that he should be favored a little bit more than he is. I think that his strength of schedule should speak for itself. He's fought legitimate competition throughout his entire career. I do think that he could be on somewhat of a decline. I don't think that he's peaking anymore. Whereas, Giga Chikadze started to reach, his pinnacle. But I think that, styles make fights, and Giga Chikadze has looked human, right? Like, he's looked human. He hasn't looked, untouchable, throughout fights. He's looked excellent because there have been some mismatches in there, and he's going to be extremely tested. Now, will he pass the test? We'll have to see. I think that there's going to be moments where he's lighting Edson Barboza up, and his kicks and everything is going to be a little too tricky for Edson Barboza. But I think Barboza's hands, Barboza's experience, I also think that the cardio of Barboza should be the X factor here if Giga Chikadze can't get him out of there early. Like, Giga has 3 rounds, in my opinion, to get it done. Outside of the first 3 rounds, I think that Edson Barboza can definitely pull away, show off that, UFC experience, and, say, okay, Giga, you're going to be something legitimate within this division, just not right now. Kind of like roadblock him for right now. Because I do think that Barboza at featherweight's a different animal. The only question for me is the durability when you're cutting a significant amount of weight. People don't realize when you cut a significant amount of weight, you can't take a shot as well as you used to. Also, in addition to that, your body is more susceptible for damaging blows. And you did see that against Cub Swanson, where Giga Chikadze dug that Giga kick right into the liver, and he folded over. So I have my concerns about both guys, right? But with all that being said, I still am leaning towards Edson Barboza, and I think the line is slightly off.
Yeah, and a couple more questions that I just want to follow up, ask you about this main event, because to me, there aren't that many main events we see that are right in line as 50-50s. We got these fighters 8,200, 8,000 on DK, but also with Edson Barboza, do you think we might see him look to wrestle here? Because one thing we've seen from Giga is he does not have very good takedown defense, nor does he have good cardio. We've seen him, and obviously we've only seen him in 3-round fights to this point. But by and large part, if those fights get to the 3rd round, he looks fairly gassed by the end of them. And it's not that we normally see Barboza look to wrestle all that much. I think the last time he landed a takedown was against Paul Felder. Yeah, against Paul Felder in 2019. So nearly 2 years since he landed a takedown. But look at some of his other recent matchups. He fought Dan Ige. No reason for him to mess around on the ground with Dan Ige. Makwan Amirkhani. Obviously, that was a fight that Barboza wanted to keep it standing. Then Shane Burgos. He was kind of having his way on the feet with Burgos. There's no need to wrestle there. I think this is a hidden path to victory for Barboza. Also scored really well on DraftKings. I think coming out and wrestling is a potential game plan for him that is going overlooked, and it's probably the least path of resistance for him.
100%. Now, the one issue with that, right, with that strategy would be with Edson Barboza not being accustomed to that type of fighting. I don't know if his cardio will be able to withstand that for the duration of 5 rounds, because he's going to be more taxing on his body because he's not a traditional wrestler. So, but I do think that being an American top team, being surrounded by some of the best coaches in the business, Mike Brown especially, I think that they're going to come up with a game plan and say, hey, if we keep Giga Chikadze on the outside, that's a glory kickboxing fight for him. He's going to feel comfortable. If we get in tight and we make it ugly and make this into an MMA fight, where even if we just start, to make Giga question the takedown, question when it's coming, pin him against the cage, make him defend a takedown or two, similar to like how, like, let's say GSP did to BJ Penn a very, very long time ago, where he wanted to drain his energy with some takedown attempts and then start to pick him apart. I do think that it's a hidden path to victory for sure. I am siding with Edson Barboza, just a better overall MMA fighter, but a Giga Chikadze knockout at this point, he's been on fire, and it really wouldn't surprise me.
Yeah, I definitely am leaning towards Barboza. Obviously, I think if Chikadze wins, he's probably going to land. It's probably going to be an early finish, and I would expect him to potentially score well in that sort of situation. But overall, is there any concern with you about how this fight might score? In some of Giga's wins, he has not scored all that well on DraftKings. I do think his path to victory probably has to be an early KO. I don't really think he's going to win if this goes to decision, just based on volume. He lands a very, very low significant strikeout, but only 3.55 significant strikes per minute. And that's generally against lower competition. So the decision wins that we've seen from Chikadze, 67, 69, 51, and 68 fantasy points. Is this a fight that you feel you need to have in your lineups today?
I don't know, Greg. I've been debating on that all morning, and I'm having a hard time with it. And I will say that when two excellent strikers get in there, sometimes you see them just staring at each other, worried about the counters, worried about getting answered on certain combinations. Similar to how like Derek Lewis and Francis Ngannou fought in their first bout, and I want to see that fight happen again. But we saw the first one, and nobody really wants to see that because they didn't do anything. There was no activity. They were worried too much. I think we could see Giga Chikadze have that in the back of his mind with Edson Barboza being such an animal, but also the 5 rounds. Like, shoot, I gotta like pace myself here. So maybe we even see a slower pace from both of these guys where it's a tit for tat type of fight. I am okay with getting away from it for some lineups for sure, because I think that there's some sneaky options on this card, some sneaky finishes coming. But man, if you told me that the winner of this bout scored over 95 points, I think I'd be pretty impressed and pretty surprised.
Yeah, I think the other thing to consider too is just some of the other fights that are around this one. The winner of Kevin Lee versus Daniel Rodriguez, I think that could score pretty well. That's going to be significant. Some of the Ultimate Fighter fights, just because there's so much on the line, we've seen with these in the past, some of those fights really turn into barn burners. And it might not be the most, tactically sound, or it might not be the best technique we see in some of those fights, but guys are out there literally fighting for their careers and they put everything on the line. And we saw that in a lot of the fights in the show. And I didn't watch in the show, I don't watch like the first 45 minutes where it's like, hey, look, we're playing pranks on each other in the house. Each Wednesday I tune in, I watch like the last 15 minutes and I watch the fights. And a lot of them are bouts where it's just really high pace. It's a lot of chaos happening. And I think there is potential for that to happen. So some of these fights, which are also priced in mid-range, I think there's potential for the winner of Brian Battle versus Gilbert Urbina to score pretty well. If Brady Heistand ends up beating Ricky Turcios, I think that could score really well, especially because Brady's likely going to be grappling oriented. So moving on to the co-main event, and I guess the co-main event, the tough finales, which fighters are you looking to target from the TV show?
So I will totally agree with you and say that for these fights, you will notice a different form of hunger. You will see that these guys will be going for it all, and not going to be reserved. They know what they're fighting for. They're fighting for that contract, and not often are both fighters given a contract. So this is kind of like a my back's against the wall, I have to perform type of situation, and that's where we could see surprises. I think the most contrarian person on this slate would probably be Gilbert Urbina at 7,600. Just based on the chalkiness of Brian Battle, how great he's looked on the season. You also bring into the fact that Gilbert Urbina is stepping up on short notice because Tresean Gore wasn't able to compete. So I think that Urbina is going to be flying under the radar significantly. But in saying that, I do think that Brian Battle is the better overall fighter. But there's a path to victory for Urbina if he mixes in some takedowns. I am favoring Brian Battle, but I'll tell you what, my confidence is a little less after seeing him on the scale. He seems like somewhat of a goofy guy in general, somewhat of a lethargic type of personality. So I don't want to be reading into it too much, but in comparison to the other fighters, I didn't think that he really looked all that great, but I do still like him in the fight. And Ricky Turcios against Brady Heistand is a fight that for the tough finales, this is probably one that I'll prioritize over the other. I do really like the wrestling of Brady Heistand. I saw on the show he has some overpowering takedowns. He really just pins his opponents against the cage. And we did see Turcios, despite having great striking, struggle at times to defend takedowns, get his legs wrapped up, get taken down. Yeah, he works back to his feet, but he gets taken down again. If this stays at range, Turcios will win. But I think Heistand knows what he's good at, and clearly he showed that on the show. So I'm back in Heistand as an underdog at 7,500. Not a week where a ton of underdogs should pop, in my opinion. But I think that Brady Hiestand is one of the best on the slate.
Yeah, I agree with you. And in terms of Brady also, he's still very raw. He's really young. He's either 22 or 21 years old. He's 22 right now, just recently turned 22. And the other thing also, he's a really strong wrestling base. That's something we've seen that plays very well, both in the UFC and for DraftKings scoring, obviously, also. And just due to his age and his overall relative lack of inexperience, I think he has the most upside of anybody that was on the show. Yeah. And also for fantasy purposes, I think he has the most upside of anybody fighting today. Because if he wins, like you said, it's going to be wrestling based. We saw Ricky in his fights get taken down quite a few times. So there's a chance that this is going to be a fight where Brady to win has to go land, 6, 7, 8 takedowns. So of all the guys in the tough finales, he's the one I'm going to have the most exposure to.
Yeah, 100%. I would agree with that. I will say that Tercios surrounds himself with some good training partners and a good training camp, mixing in some work at Team Alpha Male. So you know that he's surrounded and going to be prepared in this situation. But from fight footage and from preparation, I do still think that, when you get pinned against the cage, like we see Tercios and all the guys at Team Alpha Male training and sparring in open mat, that's one thing, right? But getting pinned against the cage and then having to defend takedowns from that situation is so different. And I think that's where Brady Hiestand can excel. So 7,500, I'd agree. He is my favorite underdog in regards to the tough finales.
All right. We do have a super chat here. And then we have talked about there's another tough fight that's on the card, although not a finale, except 2 fighters that were on the season. But first, I want to get to Coach S111. He left us a super chat. Hello, gents. When you're done breaking it down, which we're done breaking down those fights, who are your top 2 underdogs with slate breaking upside? And he is asking for DraftKings. My first answer is the guy we just talked about, Brady Hiestand. He's going to be the value play I have the most exposure to, just based on that wrestling upside. Do you agree with that? And then who else would you add to the mix?
Yeah, so I would agree with that. I think the Hiestand has the highest potential because of the path to victory, especially on DraftKings. We talk about the scoring system. Another fighter that I think in an underdog role, and I hate to say it, man, Sam Alvey, I guess. I hate Sam Alvey fights, but if I'm looking in regards to the rest of the slate, we could see a guy get knocked out for 3 times in a row, and that would be Wellington Turman. And I think that Sam Alvey, with this job on the line, I think that he might be able to step up in a situation like this. Yes, he's the age vet. His volume is lethargic. He is losing the fight until he lands that one shot. But I really feel like that could be the difference maker here. I hate to say it, and I think everybody's on the same page this week. It's just play Sam Alvey. If you're betting, Sam Alvey by KO is interesting as well. But that's a guy that I guess I would get to under the 8,000 range.
I have an answer that's also a KO or bust one, and one that I'm not going to feel good about. The other thing also with Sam Alvey, as we know, is if the fight goes to decision, it is going to score crap for DraftKings. However, Sam Alvey has big power. He is capable of landing a knockout. In general, I absolutely hate his fights because nothing happens until there's one big event. And then it's like, oh, look, somebody scored a bunch of points in the Sam Alvey fight, which does happen from time to time. For me, another KO or bust fighter who's really cheap, Abdulrazak Alhassan, who it's hard to know, is this guy coming? Is he going? It looks like he's pretty clearly on the decline because of legal issues. He had to take an extended absence away from the octagon. But if you remember him before he got into some of his legal issues, he was a killing machine. He was knocking dudes dead in the first round pretty quickly. His last few fights, Nico Price knocked him out in 43 seconds. Sabah Homasi was a fight they had to run back, which is a little questionable, but either way, the official results, he KOs him twice in the first round. Those were his last 3 fights before he had to take a step away from the octagon due to legal issues. I think there's a pretty clear path to victory for Dietricho. Number 1, he could wrestle. Number 2, Razak Alhassan does not have very good cardio. Maybe that'll be fixed with him moving weight classes. But if this fight was, I don't know, a year and a half ago, Alhassan's probably like a minus 250 favorite in this spot. So I think there's a lot of recency bias built in. He's a massive underdog, but if we're just talking about upside, there's not that much ownership going to Alhassan, and there's clearly KO potential.
100%. I mean, like you think about Alhassan against Chaos Williams, like when Chaos Williams was making his debut and, his regional scene resume was just against like middling competition, if that, like poor competition. And I was like, man, Alhassan's going to go in there and knock him out. And he ended up getting knocked out pretty stiff. So it goes to show you that he has not been the same fighter that he was at one time. I was there for the Sabah Homasi knockout, and it was absolutely brutal. I was there for the uppercut one. And I will say that confidence is one of the most important factors for fighting that a lot of people don't talk about because you can't gauge it, right? You can't gauge if a guy's confident or not. You know, a lot of people put off that bravado that they are confident, but I will say that there does seem to be somewhat of a confidence issue with Al Hassan, cardio issue as well. He's switched camps for this fight. Possibly that's a solution, but I don't think that it's an easy fight against DeKirikou. You know, he up a weight class naturally from where he used to be. I do agree with your assessment saying that he has crazy, crazy upside given his price and the fact that nobody's getting to him. I would have no problem getting to him. If he lands first, he could definitely knock out DeKirikou.
Yeah, and I mean that's where I look at it. It's also a thing. It's not like, I mean, he's somebody who I don't rate very highly as a fighter either. I mean, I think it's a fairly high variance fight, and just given the fact there's upside in an early KO for Razak Al-Hassan, it's, I mean, also I'm gonna look up do you remember his betting lines for the last few fights? Like, he was absurdly massive favorites.
Yeah, I mean, you think about the Munir Lazzez fight. I mean, he's been a favorite so much that now when the betting public is off him, this could be an opportunity where he shines. You know what I mean? Like you think about targeting a guy and he burned so many people and now everybody's off him. And this is a perfect situation where you could use this spot of getting a little contrarian and using that ownership in your advantage.
Yeah, so here it is. Last three fights, here are the lines. Munir Lazzez, minus 300 favorite. He ends up losing by decision. Chaos Williams, minus 215 favorite, ends up getting KO'd basically immediately. It was like the first strike that was thrown in it was basically the first strike that's thrown in the fight. He was just knocked dead. Then I last him out against Jacob Malkoun, just gets wrestled to death, ends up losing a decision as well. He was a minus 300 favorite in that fight. So it's pretty crazy that somebody goes from a minus 300 favorite to such a big underdog that nobody's interested in. Because also, if you remember those fights from a DFS perspective, he was chalk on all of those cards. So, I mean, I think this is a pretty big turn of events here. So I like zigging where they're zagging. That's what's going to have me on Razak Al-Hassan. But let's get into talking about the upper range of the pricing here. And, you know, some of these guys we've kind of touched on a little bit. We talked a little bit about Mana Martinez, but not really in depth. But I'm going to ask you a question that I asked you towards the top of the show we did last week also. Four fighters that are priced 9K or higher. We have Mana Martinez, JJ Aldrich, Andre Petrowski, who, by the way, was also on Tough. He's going to be fighting against another fighter who was on Tough that filled in on very short notice, Michael Gilmore. He took that fight against Gilbert Urbina on like 3 hours notice or something like that. Like, he jogged to the arena and then got choked out in 10 seconds. But to me, I think that very favorable spot for him. And then Mahmoud Muradov. So those four fighters that are 9K plus, which one do you want to target the heaviest?
I think it's Petrowski, honestly, and I think it's because of his wrestling. He's an excellent grappler, excellent wrestler. Obviously, it's a common theme among wrestlers and grapplers that when they get fatigued, it's so much easier to take advantage of them. And you did see that in the Brian Battle fight where he left his neck out there and ended up getting choked out on the Ultimate Fighter. But I will say that Petrowski brings like tenacious pace. He will get on Gilmore right from the opening bell. I think he'll pin him against the cage, work towards relentless takedowns. If he doesn't get it immediately, I think that he can accumulate several. And I think that whether it's via TKO or submission, he's getting him out of there within 2 rounds. If Gilmore somehow survives the first 2 rounds, I think that we could be looking at a dominant decision and a guy that could break the slate. So Petrowski honestly might be my favorite play on the entire slate. I am always worried about a wrestler overexerting themselves and then getting punished in later rounds if they're unable to finish, especially when you're going up against a striker. But I mean, Petrowski just makes too much sense here at 9,200. Definitely my favorite fighter on the slate in regards to finishing versus his salary.
My most rostered fighter in the build I have right now. We still got a little bit of time to lock, so maybe I'll tinker a little bit. But as of now, Andre Petrowski is my most rostered fighter in my lineup build. I agree with everything you said. That fight that he has against Michael Gilmore. Obviously, we have not seen that much of Gilmore. We also, the only time we saw him, like I said, was on extremely short notice because of an injury replacement. I can't remember who it was he replaced, but they tore their MCL on Tough and they needed somebody to fight. And Michael Gilmore was somebody who tried out for Tough, didn't make it, but was in the area. Apparently Dana White called him and he was like, sure, I'll be there. And he just showed up and fought, and it wasn't, the best ideal situation for him to show, but also he's older at this point. So Yeah, to me, I very heavily favor Petrosky. The only way I really see this going wrong is we saw him gas a little bit on his fights and tough. So maybe it's a little bit of a concern, but considering the matchup, I think he's probably going to get Gilmore out of there before that even becomes a concern.
Yeah, I mean, fatigue makes cowards of us all, right? Like everybody on this card's human, and everybody will get tired at some point, and it's a matter of how they can handle that. I think Petrosky will learn from that situation. I think that he's a very, very strong play. Definitely my favorite 9,000 option. There's still some really good, solid options in that range, but I definitely think he has the highest potential.
Yeah, and then I'm also going to ask you, which of these fighters do you have the least confidence in from a DFS standpoint? And I'm gonna preface this a little bit and kind of lead you on that I don't know what to do with JJ Aldrich because she's typically a fighter who doesn't score well. There are not very many fights where we typically see her at 9,100, but her opponent in Vanessa Demopoulos, I do not think is very good at all, and she is super aggressive if you watch tape on her. So I'm a little concerned that I don't have very much Aldridge and that Demopoulos might just charge in and just run into a lot of strikes and force the action. But of these fighters at the top, I like Aldridge the least. Do you feel differently?
No, I agree with you. I think that Aldrich, from a betting perspective, I think Murdov is an absolute, like, I think that he's a lock. I think that Aldrich is a lock. In regards to DFS, you have to think of how the fights are going to go. Murdov's pretty patient and will take his time. So I think he's going to either have a dominant decision standing up with a possibility of a late finish. So at 9,300, maybe he doesn't really reach the peak that he should. JJ Aldrich, like you said, it's a women's MMA, so it's somewhat volatile at times. Demopoulos, her best shot is getting this fight to the mat, but she does come forward a little too much for my liking. She gets hit way too much. JJ Aldrich, if she is the matador and Demopoulos is the bull, she will light her up like a Christmas tree, and I have full confidence that JJ Aldrich is going to walk away victorious. But 9,100 is a lot, given her, her output, and also just like the style of the fight. I don't think that she could get her out of there with one clean shot, right? She runs into a check hook or something like that. But I'd much rather target Petrosky and the KO upside of Mana Martinez, despite the grappling path to victory that Kennedy has. I think Mana Martinez and Petrosky are my two 9,000 options that I will be prioritizing today.
Yeah, and it concerns me because, like I said, I do not think that Demopoulos is very good. She's really aggressive. However, I still have to think there's more upside in Martinez and Petrosky and Murdov. So I ultimately am probably going to either be really light or not even have Aldrich just because I want to be in favor of some of these other fighters. And still, Aldrich, 23.8% projected ownership right now. So she's still going to be relatively popular. I would feel different if it was like, 8% or something like that. But she's still going to be somewhat popular. So I'll just side with the other fighters that I feel more confident in the upside. And now I want to get to, we have a question in our premium Slack chat. If anybody else has questions, at me, at Pete, I have Slack open. I'm going to be reading everything here. But Crimson Raider asks, and I think this is a good fight for us to talk about next. Thoughts on Lee in the MVP spot on FanDuel? Thanks, Greg and Pete. So I want to ask you, number one, what do you think of Kevin Lee as an MVP choice? And then what do you make of that fight overall?
Easily my hardest fight to break down because you talk about what Kevin Lee's potential versus his results. And now at a higher weight class. And then you also think about, D-Rod, about how he's going to respond to a massive step up in competition. Yes, he has skills, but if you look at his strength of schedule in the UFC, it's not facing Kevin Lee's. I think that the price on Kevin Lee is a little ridiculous. I think that given his wrestling, if he goes out there and he's able to get one takedown and his cardio is better at this weight class, I think he's going to smash that salary right there. I really do. But in saying that, I got no faith in Kevin Lee to do that because we've seen him fall apart at times where he gets hit, he gets wobbled by the slightest, shots. His cardio abandons him. So it's a volatile matchup. With all that being said, the upside is crazy on Kevin Lee. I think how D-Rod pulls this off is having to overcome some adversity and kind of just, coming back and pulling off a comeback victory, whereas Kevin Lee could be dominant from the opening bell. So Kevin Lee in the MVP or in a champion spot, I think makes a ton of sense, given his salary, given his path to victory, given what he can do from the top position. I just still worry, man. Like, this is easily my hardest fight to break down.
Kevin Lee is so untrustworthy. And it's so crazy, too, because we talk about his upside, his peak. He absolutely smashed Edson Barboza when they fought. I thought that was the peak of his career. At that point, we saw that Kevin Lee fight against Edson Barboza. I thought, all right, this guy's on track. He's a potential title contender, title winner down the stretch. And that was also coming off fight against Tony Ferguson. He was smashing Tony Ferguson until he gassed out, which right. I get that Kevin Lee does gas out a lot, but he was also dealing with a really nasty staph infection that fight. And he was looking really good. And this is not the Kevin Lee of, the last couple of years. This was like peak Tony Ferguson right. that Kevin Lee was beating up a little bit. Then, a wonky performance against Al Iaquinta, fights RDA, is beating RDA, gasses, starches Gregor Gillespie with a head kick. Then last time out against Charles Oliveira, fairly competitive fight, but obviously no shame, and end up getting submitted by Charles Oliveira in a fight that was pretty competitive for 3 rounds up until then. So I don't know what version of Kevin Lee we're getting here. There's so many unknowns. Fighting a different weight class. He's torn both his ACLs. Not that this should matter. He's got the most ridiculous looking tattoo I've ever seen, which make that of what you will as well. But yeah, I think the winner of this fight should score very well, though. So it's when I'm targeting very heavily. I don't know which side I really prefer, but both sides I want to be overweight to. Is that a conclusion that you're fine with reaching as well?
Yeah, absolutely. I do see that some people in chat are saying that D-Rod's really good. He trains out of 10th Planet Jiu-Jitsu and has good jiu-jitsu. That's very true. But the problem is when jiu-jitsu fighters face off against strong top heavy wrestlers, that they are fishing for submissions all the time and losing rounds as the seconds tick off that clock. So we've seen Kevin Lee in longer bouts, and I think in a 3-round bout, he could possibly, just do enough to edge out on the scorecards and stay out of some sticky situations. So, man, it's such a tough fight. It really is a tough fight, but I do think the upside lies with Kevin Lee.
It's funny, though, and also people bringing up a 10th Planet. Who's probably the most successful 10th Planet fighter in all of UFC history is Tony Ferguson. Mm-hmm. And Kevin Lee kind of controlled Tony Ferguson on the ground for the entirety of that fight until he just gassed out, tried to rest for a second from top position, ends up getting submitted. But, in that fight, Kevin Lee ended up landing 3 takedowns. He controlled them for nearly 5 minutes. It was either the end of the first or the second round. He had Ferguson mounted. And if that round had another 15, 20 seconds, he might have finished Tony Ferguson at that point. So, if we're just talking about it from a 10th Planet perspective, not that this is how you should go and evaluate fights, but right. Tony Ferguson's probably the best 10th Planet guy that's ever fought in the UFC, and Kevin Lee kind of had his way on the ground with him until he got tired. So I do think at the very least this with Kevin Lee, it greatly benefits him that he only has to fight 3 rounds instead of 5. When he fights some of those 5-round fights, it's kind of like, boy, Kevin Lee gassing feels a little inevitable. But 3 rounds, I think, is a better chance of holding it together over the course of the shorter fight. So in terms of value plays now, we've talked about the high end. We've hit on some of the fights that people had asked us about. In terms of some other cheaper values, who are maybe some high variance guys we have not mentioned yet that you would like to target?
Yeah. Man. Well, I think if we're talking about, I really like Dustin Jacoby today, and I know that he's not in the cheap range at all, but I just have to bring him up. I think that Dustin Jacoby, being the guy comfortable with this weight class, having excellent, striking, really good calf kicks, good leg kicks, good distance management. His takedown defense did not look good last against Ion Cutelaba. He defended some takedowns, but he still got taken down. I think it was 9 or 10 times. That's a lot, but he's such an overpowering wrestler. I think that Dustin Jacoby in a matchup like this against Darren Stewart, I think this is like tailor-made for him, man. I think that Stewart gets hurt on the feet too often. He gets a little desperate, and I think that we could see a finish here. Dustin Jacoby, one of my favorite plays on the entire slate. I know if you go back and you look at some of his box scores, you're like, oh, well, he seems like he's just going to get a decision. Well, that's what happened against Maxim Grishin at 55 points. He did get a KO, TKO over Justin Ledet, scored 119. There was, in the draw against Ion Cutelaba, so let's say that they scored a victory. He would have scored 75 points in that bout. Not the best at 8,800, but you also have to take into the durability of Darren Stewart, and he's been hurt a lot within his UFC tenure. I just think that Jacoby's, I'm surprised he wasn't 9,000. I really like him here. I think from a parlay piece, he's like a must-have for me. I think that going to Murdov and Jacoby makes a lot of sense for parlays. I know they're not the odds that you want to see by any means, but it's helpful. It is helpful. I think they're both going to walk away with the victory.
And then how do you feel about Darren Stewart on the other side in tournaments? He's somebody I'm currently getting not a ton of exposure to, but he's certainly in the mix for me. The main reason is because if Stewart wins, I expect it to come via grappling, and that's what I think could present a little bit upside. Jacoby only 61% takedown defense. Darren Stewart, especially in recent fights, we've seen him a little bit more aggressive looking for takedowns. He landed 2 in his last fight against Eric Anders. Lost 2 losses ago. He fought against Kevin Holland, took Kevin Holland down 3 times. No, taking down Kevin Holland, it's since been is no real tough task per se, but Jacoby doesn't have the best takedown defense. We've seen Stewart a little more willing to wrestle in recent fights. Is that something that has you interested in him at all?
I think for tournaments, it makes sense. I think that it's the path of least resistance. He needs to avoid getting hit and picked apart on the outside by Dustin Jacoby. I will say for me, the reason I'm a little hesitant on Darren Stewart is I think he's a little undersized for 205. Outside of his fight against Eric Anders, he's a guy that used to fight at 185 pounds, and you're not talking about bumping up to 195. That doesn't exist. You're talking about bumping up to 205. That's a big gap, and those guys at 205 are monsters. And a guy like Dustin Jacoby, I think it's just a little bit too large for him to deal with at this, at this stage of the game, especially since he's, taken so much damage within his career. But everything you said, it holds true and it holds merit. It really is. It's important to have exposure to Darren Stewart because of the takedown potential. But I think it's going to be tough sledding, in my opinion. So I'm a little bit more aggressive towards Dustin Jacoby. But as far as tournament plays, Darren Stewart does make some sense.
We do have an interesting question here in the YouTube chat from a Real Deal Prime. He's saying, do you see the majority of fights going the distance or ending before? It's kind of funny because there's a bunch of fights that I think are going to be really high-paced fights that could score really well that I don't think will finish inside the distance, like Kevin Lee versus Daniel Rodriguez. I think that fight isn't super likely to finish, but I think the winner should still score well. Both the tough finale fights, Ricky Turcios versus Brady Heistand, I don't think that one's going to finish inside the distance, but I do think it should score well. Same with Battle Urbina. I think that should be high-paced. Some of these undercard fights, Mana Martinez versus Guido Canetti, I think that's fairly likely to finish inside the distance. Alvi Turman, good chance to finish inside the distance. Al Hassan versus DiChirico, that should finish inside the distance. So it's kind of a weird card where even the ones that aren't going to finish inside the distance, I still think have a really high upside. So I'm finding it hard to take fights out of my player pool. So I want to ask you, are there any fights you look at and just say like, hey, this is a fight that I don't have interest in?
I think pace is something that isn't talked about a lot. You have to figure out, it's important to look at people's fighters' records and see how many finishes they've had or how much damage they've taken to somewhat get a read on which fights could end up finishing. Then you can look at, the Vegas lines and all that. But I do think that we could be looking at a night where this is going to be a long night. For me, I think Pat Sabatini will be a guy a lot of people get exposure to. He's a very strong wrestler, comes from a great camp, and I think that he's an underdog people want exposure to because of the wrestling path to victory. But Jamal Emmers isn't a bad fighter at all, and in my opinion, will probably have the striking advantage. That fight probably goes the distance. So for me, just to get a little different, I think I'm going to be a little underweight to that fight. In addition to the DiChirico Razak Al Hassan, oddly enough, I don't see that fight ending inside the distance. I think that Al Hassan is going to try to make some adjustments to his style because he knows that it screwed him in the past 3 fights. And I think that he's going to try to win on the scorecards, but I don't find him doing that here. I have to bring this up because I do see some people saying I was back in D-Rod. Well, I still think that D-Rod can pull off the victory. I am just worried about D-Rod being on the bottom. I really am. And as far as I don't like a lot of the underdogs on this slate, to be honest. So I have to pick somebody under 8,000. I mean, Sam Alvey, it hurts for me to pick him, but you know what I mean? I got to pick Sam Alvey and Brady Heistand. Outside of that, I don't really like any of these underdogs. So given all the questions surrounding Kevin Lee, I have no problem getting to Daniel Rodriguez. And that's why I was advocating him earlier. His pace, his volume, and just his well-rounded skill set makes too much sense at that price range in comparison to the rest of the underdogs.
Yeah, and I mean, this is a fight. There's a whole lot of questions and variance here. And that's something where we start to talk about some of the UFC DFS. there is, like people come in, and I know it's a question you hate, where people say, who are the locks? There typically are not really locks in UFC. It's a very high variance sport. It's not like there's a situation where it's like, oh, the Lakers are playing the Lakers are playing the Hornets today, and the Hornets are resting all of their starters because they're tanking at the end of the season. You don't really get those situations very often in the UFC. Every once in a while, you get a Hamzat Chimaev fighting against, like a regional fighter on 3 days' notice, and he's like a minus 2,000 favorite. Yeah, exactly. When he fought Reese McKee, and Reese McKee took off on like 3 days or something like that, and I don't think Reese McKee landed a strike in that fight, which those are very few and far between. And this is a sport that's way harder to predict than it is the case in other sports. So ultimately, it's a situation where we kind of have to take advantage of who's the field rostering, who are they getting to. And, I think that when you consider that this is a fight between Daniel Rodriguez and Kevin Lee that should score really well, the field seems pretty split on them. I want to get to both sides of it. And this is a fight where that's something I don't have an issue with doing. If you're playing one lineup, I think that's a pretty tough question to answer, but I'll ask you, in single entry, who would you be more apt to play between Kevin Lee and Daniel Rodriguez?
In a single lineup, I'd probably go Kevin Lee based on strength of schedule and what we've seen of how he looked good, and just the potential with his style for DraftKings. I do think that if you're playing in a 20 max or a 150 max, that in order to get different, you should target some fights on both sides, like hedging your bet in a way. You know what I mean? Like you want to have exposure to the fights that you think are volatile or, are going to have high point totals. And to me, can you imagine that fight not producing? I have a very, very difficult time seeing that fight not produce as far as DFS is considered.
Yeah. So the other thing too is we look at some of the metrics from this fight, Kevin Lee versus Daniel Rodriguez. It's also it's a style clash, and these fights typically tend to score very well for this reason. Kevin Lee, if he's able to implement his game plan, if he lands takedowns and he's able to hold top position, I mean, he could land 5-6 takedowns in this fight, maybe submit Daniel Rodriguez and rack up a lot of ground control time. If he's not able to take down Daniel Rodriguez lands 8.07 significant strikes per minute compared to 3.9 significant strikes per minute for Kevin Lee. There's a pretty good chance that being, although actually weirdly, Kevin Lee has a longer reach in this fight, like crazy long reach for a guy who's 5'9", 77-inch reach. But still, Daniel Rodriguez is somebody who I consider to be the better stand-up fighter. There's a lot more volume there. Given that we've seen Kevin Lee gas in the past, if he's not able to land takedowns and that tires him out, Daniel Rodriguez might piece him up in the feet. And like you said, he's somebody who's also been chinny in his career. Potential that he finishes him there. So I would be very surprised if the winner of this fight does not score well.
Yeah. And, I really think that the reason we're spending so much time on this fight is because it's probably the most pivotal on the entire slate. I'm going to ask you, is the winner of this fight optimal?
I think so. It's a fight that I'm overweight to both sides. I don't have, I think this is the fight. Let me actually scroll through my lineups. So other than the main event, this is the fight I have the second most exposure to.
Makes sense. And the reason the main event's so popular in your lineups is because of the price point, 8,200, 8,000. That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, I wouldn't at all be surprised if the winner of this fight scores better than the winner of the main event, especially if it's Giga who ends up winning. Giga, unless he gets early finishes, is typically not scored all that well on DraftKings. So I think there's a fairly good chance that the winner of this fight does outscore the winner of the main event. So very high priority fight for me to target. I'm going to ask you in a second which fight that you are also targeting as a pretty high priority. But first, I want to bring up that today's show is sponsored by Monkey Knife Fight. If you guys are new to Monkey Knife Fight, head on over to the site, check it out. It's a little bit of a different way to get a DFS experience. Prop-based contests generally based on strikes. There are some contests also significant strikes. We'll be looking at some fights and say, do you think guys are going to get more or less of individual strike stats? It's a pretty fun way, different way to play DFS. And if you guys want to check it out, head on over to the site. Use the promo code Awesemo to make your first deposit, and you can get a match bonus of up to $100 is over at Monkey Knife Fight using the promo code Awesemo. Now, also, if you guys have any questions, fire those in. Pete and I have about 10 minutes left before we turn it over to MLB Live Before Lock. But bad news for anybody who doesn't like me, because I'm going to be doing MLB Live Before Lock directly after this. Also, lots of content coming up in the YouTube channel, MLB Live Before Lock, and NFL preseason Live Before Lock. But once again, if you guys have any questions, fire those in. Outside of that, Pete, which fights do you think should score really well, regardless of who wins, that we haven't talked about yet?
First fight of the night, Mana Martinez, Guido Canetti. I think that either Mano Martinez, despite all the outside influences and the passing of his coach and missing weight, I think that he has some extremely high potential on the slate. We mentioned it earlier in the show. I think that he could get that Francis Ngannou early KO bonus. He's an extremely aggressive striker. He packs a heavy, heavy punch. He has good kicks. As long as he's able to defend the takedown, I do like his chances here. Now, in saying that, the underdog has a path to victory, but it's a least likely path to victory of him implementing takedowns, forcing the fight to the mat, trying to work towards a submission. Guido Canetti has been somewhat susceptible to big shots on the feet, which also enforces my opinion about Mano Martinez, being a strong play on the slate.
Yeah, I mean, like you said, there's some unknown factors there. Personally, for me, actually, I don't have Guido Canetti in my player pool right now. I'm not super high on Mano Martinez, because it's relative to, the field has him at 40% right now. So, how much exposure could I really get to him to be different than that number? But I personally feel more confident rostering Muradov or Petrosky, which isn't really a knock on Martinez, just other fighters that I prefer to pay up for in the high end. But he's still going to be in my player pool. I like him. Canetti, though, is he somebody that you're putting into a decent chunk of lineups?
No, I can't. Just he's so untrustworthy, right? That if he wins, it's probably going to be a high scoring affair because he's going to be implementing takedowns or lands a big shot of his own. But God, man, no. That's what I'm saying, where there are a few fights on this card where you really see both fighters with high potential for scoring well. And, that's why the Kevin Lee D-Rod was such a popular topic on this card. Outside of that, what happens if Wellington Turman isn't knocked out by Sam Alvey?
The winner scores like 40 points in a decision win.
Right? Yeah, right? I know that Wellington Turman has strong wrestling, but traditionally, you think about Sam Alvey, good takedown defense, low volume. And you wonder what Turman is going to do in a situation where he's been knocked out in back-to-back fights.
These stats are just staggeringly scary. This fight can end up being a staring contest. Sam Alvey lands 3.2 significant strikes per minute. Wellington Turman lands 2.44. Turman, typically, one of the reasons we see his significant strike stats pretty low is because he is aggressively looking for takedowns. Like you said, Sam Alvey has an 82% takedown defense. Historically, he's been known as being one of the guys with toughest takedown defense in all of the UFC. The last time we've seen Sam Alvey taken down multiple times, actually, Ryan Spann took him down multiple times back in 2020. That was a split decision. Before that, you have to go back to a fight against Rashad Evans when Rashad Evans was still pretty good back in 2017 to find a spot where Sam Alvey was taken down multiple times. So it doesn't happen very often, and he's only been taken down twice in his career. He's only been taken down multiple times in his career 3 times, and he's been in the UFC since 2014. So my gut feeling is that if Sam Alvey is either going to land a pretty quick knockout with Wellington Turman being risky, or that fight's just going to score absolute crap for DraftKings.
Yeah, it's a great assessment. It's crazy to think that Alvey has 2 split decision losses to Ryan Spann and Da Un Jung. Both those guys are nasty. And, that was back in May 2020 and October 2020. So, there's definitely potential there. But let's also look at the most recent fight where Julian Marquez, knocked him down and then was able to submit him with a rear naked choke. So if Wellington Turman is somehow able to land a shot and rock Sam Alvey, maybe the Sam Alvey of old, the guy has lost 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 of his last 6, and this other one is a draw. So he is 0-5-1. Goodness gracious.
King of the split decision, also of those fights. Da Un Jung, split decision. Ryan Spann, split decision. His last win against John Vellante, split decision. He's got some majority decisions on there, split decisions. Sam Alvey is in a lot of fights that are really difficult to score because not only does he not have significant strike output, he typically limits the offense of the fighters he goes against him. And you get into these spots where it's like, hey, Sam Alvey landed 50 significant strikes. His opponent landed 51. Who won? And then it's just you leave it up to the judges, and then Sam Alvey gets upset after the fight. We see that happen very, very frequently. We have another super chat here from our guy, Coach S. He's once again going back to the D-Rod Kevin Lee fight. He's saying, is this fight worth a stack at all, in hope for a third round winner or high scoring decision? To me, no, for a couple of reasons. Number one, because of the stylistic clash. As much as this fight is, we don't know the outcome of it and we think it's kind of up for grabs, I don't think it's going to be especially competitive. I think one of these guys, either Kevin Lee's going to either land takedowns at will and is going to have his way with Daniel Rodriguez on the ground. If he's not able to take down Daniel Rodriguez, I think he's going to get pieced up on the feet. So I don't know who's going to win. I think the winner is going to score very well, but I think the loser is going to score very poorly.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And even it could be a situation where if somebody does come from behind, it's a little too late, whereas their production doesn't really match some other fighters on the card. And if you stacked, it doesn't really make a lot of sense. I'm looking on the card, and I'm not really a stacker in regards to MMA DFS unless it makes a ton of sense, because you need both guys to really come through and need some underdogs to fail. I would be okay with stacking the main event in a few lineups, only because I do think that this could go all 5 rounds. And if this stays out on the feet, obviously striking is not favored on DraftKings by any means, but volume can somewhat make up for that. And if some other underdogs have a difficult time on the slate, 8,200 and 8,000 fighters coming through in a stack in the main event, I think is a little contrarian. And I think that it has some possible potential with you being able to save up, some remaining salary and spend up elsewhere.
All right. We do have another question here in our premium Slack chat from Woody C. How much Petrosky is too much Petrosky? I have him in 59% of lineups in the build I have right now. I don't know that's going to be my final is, but honestly, depending how many lineups you're playing, if you were to ask me one guy who to lock in and play in like 20-20 or 5-5 lineup, I would personally say Petrosky. So once again, Woody, this depends how many lineups you're playing, but there's honestly, for me, there's not a number to me that's too high. I think he's really safe, and I think the upside is very substantial.
Yeah, I think he's extremely safe. I'm fine with getting to him in 60-70% of your lineups. I just think that he has the highest potential in the 9,000 options. And I want to be over the field in a situation like that. And you have to really reach those numbers in order to do so.
All right. We do have a final follow-up super chat from our guy, Coach S, who, by the way, thanks for all the super chats. It is much appreciated. He's saying good points to you and I, and saying that we're very good at what we do, and he hopes we have a good weekend. Hope you have a good weekend too, and I hope you come out on the right side of the D-Rod Kevin Lee fight, as I hope all of us do, because that is certainly a tough one to call today. Let's see. Is there anything? Just a few minutes left here, guys. So if you guys have any questions, fire those in. Also, like this video, subscribe to the YouTube channel. Like I said, I'm going to be on MLB Live Before Lock right after this with Terry McBride. Then we have the NFL preseason Live Before Lock, so you're going to want to stick around for all of that. Pete, is there anybody that we have not mentioned that you'd like us to talk about in the final couple minutes of the show?
I mean, I think we have to mention it just because there is a possibility of it, given her grappling accolades, is the potential of an armbar from guard from Demopoulos against Aldrich. Obviously, that she's at a size disadvantage in this matchup. I don't really think Demopoulos is all that good, but her grappling is legit. And if she's on her back, we have seen JJ Aldrich get a little too comfortable in people's guards sometimes, where she leaves her neck out there, leaves her arm on the mat. If she's lazy in top position, Demopoulos can easily throw up an armbar from guard. So 7,100, you always have to target women's MMA in the underdog as a potential of that, coming through. So I think that would be just a tiny sprinkle. I think that she's not a good fighter, but there is a path to victory there.
I hate some of these low women's MMA fights. I've always said, here's the way that you would really want to be able to get rich betting these low level women's MMA. Just there should be an armbar from guard prop on all sports books, because it hits like 75% of the time. Where it's like, oh look, she's piecing her up on the feet. Then oh look, she went for a takedown and now she lost. It happens. It happens all the time.
Yep.
So I hope that's not what happens. I'm personally not going to be on Demopoulos today. I'm not really going to be on JJ Aldrich either, but I can never rule out that possibility in a lower level women's MMA fight. And I'm just going to scan really quick the Slack chat and YouTube to see if anybody has questions. By the way, on Jason's just the way he's calling football games. Don't worry, he's going to be back next week. He'll be back. I was just here 2 weeks in a row. People started to think like, oh, Greg did it 2 weeks in a row, never done it before. Jason's just fine. He'll be right back. I'm just keeping his seat warm. But other than that, guys, thank you very much for watching. If you have any questions for Pete and I, jump into the Slack chat. We know there's a little bit of time until the card starts. So hop in Slack. You can ask us more questions there if you want. Other than that, good luck today, guys. Stick around. MLB Live Before Lock is next.